On a winter night at the Olympia in Paris, midway through Edith Piaf's set, a stagehand leaned toward the wings and passed along a piece of information that was never meant to reach the stage at all. It was nothing official. No note had been written, no announcement made. A theater employee, walking the back aisles during the second half of the program, had recognized a face in the audience and mentioned it, almost in passing, to one of the stagehands near the wings. The kind of small backstage gossip that happens during every show, in every theater, and almost never matters. Yves Montand was sitting near the back of the house, in a seat that had not been listed under his name. By the time the information reached the wings, it was nothing more than a whisper between two men standing in the dark, watching the stage. But Edith Piaf, between songs, glanced toward the wings, the way performers do, checking timing, checking cues, and one of the stagehands, without thinking, without any sense that it mattered, mouthed two words toward her. "Montand's here." To understand why those two words changed the rest of the evening, you have to understand what the Olympia meant in Paris during this period, and what it meant for Edith Piaf to be standing on that stage at all. By the time of this performance, the Olympia had become one of the most important stages in French entertainment, a theater where a single night could define how an artist was spoken about for years afterward. It was not simply a large room with good acoustics. It was a kind of proving ground, a place where Paris decided, collectively and often silently, who still mattered. Performers who filled the Olympia were performers who belonged to the city in a way that smaller venues could not confer. Edith Piaf had played the Olympia many times by this point in her career, and each time carried its own weight, not because she needed to prove anything to the audience, but because the audience itself had changed over the years, and she had changed with it. The audience at the Olympia, on a night like this, was rarely uniform. It included ordinary Parisians who had saved for tickets, critics who would write about the performance the next morning, and, scattered throughout the house, other performers, singers, actors, musicians, who came not as fans exactly, but as members of the same small professional world, watching one of their own. This was part of what made the Olympia different from other venues. The people on stage knew that some of the people watching understood, in ways an ordinary audience member could not, exactly what they were seeing. The difficulty of certain passages, the risk of certain choices, the years of work behind what looked, from the seats, like effortless command of a room. The program that night had been built carefully, the way her programs always were. There was a structure to it, songs that opened the night with warmth, songs that built toward the emotional center of the evening, and songs reserved for the end, when the audience had been brought as close as they were going to get. Edith Piaf rarely deviated from a program once it had been set. The orchestra knew the order. The lighting cues followed the order. Changing anything mid-performance meant asking dozens of people to adjust in real time in front of a full house without rehearsal. She had not planned to change anything that night. To understand what Yves Montand's presence in that audience actually meant, you have to go back to a much earlier point in both of their careers, a point when neither of them was yet the figure they would later become. Years before this Olympia performance, Edith Piaf had been one of the most established names in French entertainment, while Yves Montand had been a young performer still finding his way, singing in clubs that were a long way from the Olympia in every sense. Edith Piaf had taken an interest in him during this period, not in a vague, encouraging way, but in the way she took interest in performers she believed in. She introduced him to people who mattered. She gave him opportunities he would not otherwise have had access to. And for a period of time, their relationship extended beyond mentorship into something more personal. A relationship that, like most things in Edith Piaf's life during that era, was intense, became well known among the people around them, and did not last. What remained afterward was complicated in the way these things often are. There was no public rupture, no dramatic falling out that people could point to and discuss. Both of them moved forward, Edith Piaf continuing the career she had already built, Yves Montand beginning the ascent that would eventually make him one of the most recognized French performers of his generation, in music and later in film. They crossed paths occasionally, as performers in the same small world inevitably do. They were polite, they were professional, and underneath all of that, there was a shared history that neither of them discussed, but that both of them carried. For Yves Montand, attending an Edith Piaf performance at the Olympia was not an unusual thing to do. Paris performers attended each other's shows. It was part of how the community worked, a way of staying connected to what was happening on the city's stages. There was nothing remarkable about his presence in the audience on paper. He had not announced it. He had taken a seat that did not draw attention. By every outward measure, he was simply one more face in a packed theater, there to watch a show. But for Edith Piaf, standing under the lights, with the orchestra waiting for her cue, those two whispered words from the wings did something that no other piece of information could have done in that moment. They collapsed the distance between the stage and a specific point in her past, instantly, without warning, in front of 2,000 people who had no idea anything had changed. This was the moment the evening pivoted, not because anything visible happened, but because of what happened in the few seconds after she heard those words. The program called for a particular song next, a song the audience expected, a song that fit the careful architecture of the evening exactly as it had been planned. Edith Piaf had 30 seconds, perhaps less, before the orchestra's introduction would begin, before the moment to make any change would close. The choice in front of her was small in scale and enormous in weight. Stay with the program as written, or signal, quietly, almost invisibly, a change. Changing a song mid-performance was not simple. It meant the conductor would need to recognize her signal instantly. The orchestra would need to shift to a different arrangement they had not been expecting to play that night, and the audience would receive a program that no longer matched what had been announced, without anyone explaining why. For most performers, this kind of last-minute change was something to be avoided at almost any cost. A risk to the evening's rhythm, a risk to the orchestra's confidence, a risk that something might go visibly wrong in front of a full house. Edith Piaf gave the signal. It was small, a glance toward the conductor, a slight gesture, the kind of communication that performers and musicians who have worked together for years can read without anyone in the audience noticing anything at all. The conductor's eyes moved across his score for a fraction of a second, found what he was looking for, and gave the smallest possible nod back. The orchestra adjusted. To the audience, nothing appeared to change. The transition between songs happened with the same smoothness it always did, the same brief pause, the same lights shifting slightly for the next number. But the song that began was not the song that had been planned. It was a song about a relationship that had already ended by the time it was being sung. Not a song of anger, and not a song of simple sadness, but something quieter than either. A song about looking back at something that had mattered, without needing it to come back, and without pretending it hadn't existed. It was the kind of song Edith Piaf had sung many times before, to many audiences, in many contexts that had nothing to do with Yves Montand at all. But tonight, somewhere in the dark of that packed theater, one person in the audience understood exactly what was happening, and exactly why. For everyone else in the Olympia that night, this was simply Edith Piaf doing what she always did, taking a song and filling it with more feeling than the melody alone seemed able to hold, the way she had done countless times before, in countless other performances. The orchestra played beautifully. Her voice carried the way it always carried, reaching the back rows of the theater without strain, holding the audience in the particular stillness that only her performances seemed to produce. If anyone noticed that the program had changed, they likely assumed it was simply an adjustment. Performers did this sometimes, responding to the mood of a particular night, the energy of a particular crowd. What they could not have known, what almost no one in that theater could have known, was that the song was not being sung to them at all. It was being sung past them, toward a single seat near the back of the house, to a person who had once been part of her life in a way that the rest of the audience had no way of imagining. Yves Montand, sitting in that seat, would have heard the song the way everyone around him heard it, as a beautiful performance, a highlight of an already remarkable evening. But somewhere underneath that, if he recognized what had happened, if he understood the way only someone who had once been close to her could understand, that this particular song, at this particular moment, was not an accident, then for those few minutes, the largest room in French entertainment became, for exactly two people, something much smaller and much more private. When the song ended, the audience responded the way audiences always responded to Edith Piaf, with the kind of applause that filled the entire theater, sustained, full of genuine appreciation for what they had just witnessed. The program continued. The next song began on schedule, exactly as planned, as though nothing unusual had occurred. To the orchestra, to the stagehands, to the thousands of people in their seats, the evening simply went on. Afterward, no one backstage spoke about what had happened in any detail. The stagehand who had passed along the whispered information likely never thought about it again. It was, after all, just a piece of gossip, the kind that circulates through every theater on every night, usually forgotten within the hour. The conductor, who had read her signal and adjusted the orchestra without missing a beat, had done exactly what conductors who worked with Edith Piaf were expected to do: respond instantly, ask no questions, trust that she knew what she was doing. What the moment revealed, in the end, was something about the particular kind of control Edith Piaf exercised over her own performances. Not control in the sense of rigidity, but control in the sense of total ownership. The program for the evening had been built in advance, agreed upon, rehearsed. And yet when something unexpected entered the room, something that belonged entirely to her own history, something the audience could never have anticipated, she did not let it disrupt the evening. She absorbed it. She folded it into the performance itself in a way so seamless that the thousands of people watching never knew anything had changed at all. For the two people who understood what had actually happened that night, the moment passed without acknowledgement, without conversation, without ever being confirmed between them in any way that history recorded. Yves Montand's career would continue to grow in the years that followed, eventually carrying him far beyond the world of Paris cabaret and into international film. Edith Piaf would continue to perform at the Olympia many more times, each appearance carrying its own history, its own private moments, folded invisibly into nights that the rest of the world experienced as simply extraordinary performances. Neither of them ever spoke publicly about that particular evening. There was no interview, no memoir passage, no quote that confirmed exactly what had passed between them in those few minutes. What exists instead is something closer to an account passed quietly among people who were present that night. A stagehand's whispered message, a conductor's barely visible nod, a song that did not belong on the program, and an audience that clapped for a performance they did not know was also something else entirely. That is, in the end, what made the evening unrepeatable. Not because something dramatic happened in front of 2,000 people, nothing dramatic did, as far as any of them could tell, but because, for the span of a single song, the largest stage in Paris became, for exactly two people, the smallest room in the world, and everyone else in the building simply thought they were watching a great show.